Okay, this is Michael, and a while ago I got the idea to record what I'm doing programming to help me remember to create, a log of like what's actually happened and to help me remember kind of the tricky things that I've gotten over. Um, because if I want to build something again, it's a good resource and can kind of remind me how to do something. I feel like with programming, there's a lot of stops and starts. So I'm building this site. I don't love the name. It's called Podcast All Stars or Podstars, I guess, right there in the tab. And what it is, it's a directory of podcasts. But instead of listing like by shows, instead of the index being by shows, the index is by guest on the show. There's a few guests, like Jason Lumpkin, for instance, who I really like when he's on my favorite podcasts. And so I want to know like all the shows that he is on and, be able to kind of list people that way on a site versus by the podcast channel, by the podcast, feed. So I started building this, and there's a few things that got a little tricky, and I just wanted to dig in and show how I figured things out, and then just to document it. So what we're doing, so this is a CRUD app, and the basics, and we have. Let's get to the controllers. We have a star. So this is, Jason Lumpkin, Steve Ballmer. These are like, the centerpiece, the main index. We have episodes and stars have many episodes, right? Because they'll be on many shows. And then episodes belong to podcasts. So they belong to stars. They also belong to podcasts. So we're tracking a model for the show, we're tracking a model for the star, and then the episode kind of belongs to both. And so the two tricks that I wanted to show, so we can, create, show, edit, destroy the star, Jason Lumpkin, and edit, right? It's going to look like a simple edit page. Of course, this is slow when the recording's going on, right? But we have name, bio, we have his link, an image, and that's kind of what the model is for a star. If we want to show that, what we wanted to do is we wanted to list on the star show page, we wanted to list their episodes. And so an episode has a title, a description, it belongs to a star, and it belongs to a podcast. And so we wanted to show those. And then so that's not too tough, right? You just load in, let's see this actually. So, all right, let's try to find it now. So when we show the star, right, we're going to show the episodes. And so if we go into the star controller on the show page, we're just going to load in the episodes, and that's at star.episodes because episodes belong to star. So we load that in. And then on the star show page, we have that instance variable, and then we can kind of iterate through it with all of the episodes and kind of print out their title, description, star ID, and podcast ID. So that's what we're seeing here. Where it got a little trickier is now I want to add an episode to this star. So he's on another podcast, right? That's the title of the episode. And then I want to do the description of the episode, like Jason is the guest, right? So this is the title, the episode title, the description of the episode, and then two things. One, we know that Jason is the star that this episode belongs to because we're adding it from his page. So first, how do we do that? And then second, we're going to choose a podcast, right? So we're going to make this a drop-down menu. But what if that podcast doesn't exist? How do we handle that? We need to create the podcast first and then make the episode. And so these are not too tough, but they were definitely like curveballs that I had to deal with. So first, let's talk about how we make Jason the star that the episode belongs to without showing it, right? So we have star ID number 1 in the params, and this is the episode form for, right? So do we have it up here? This is the episode form for that we're showing, that we're putting on the star page. And so let's just check that out real quick. So if we go to the show page, we're rendering the episodes form, right, and passing in that episode. So the episodes form, let's see what that looks like. We're asking for the title, the description, and then if we scroll down, the podcast ID. We'll get to this in a second. And you can see here is form hidden field, and we're passing in the star ID. This is kind of what Rails makes when you create a model, right? When Rails creates a form, it automatically builds this kind of like drop-down menu because this is an integer. So it knows to make that a drop-down menu. We don't want to show that, and we want it to pass in the star ID. And so here's the code that shows the form.hidden fields. That's a hidden field. And then what's the attribute we're going to fill? And then we can autofill the value and make that at star ID. And at star loads because from the star's controller, at star is finding that star from the params ID. So at star, that will create the instance variable. And then on the form 4, we're pushing in the ID of that instance variable, and then we make it hidden. So that wasn't too bad. And when I'm doing this documentation, I put in where I found the answer as well. The trickier thing to do was in this drop-down menu. So if the podcast is already there, then the user would select, this is the podcast, and we're going to create it. But what we wanted to do is if that podcast isn't there, we don't want to create the episode without a podcast. So we made this button called Create New Podcast. And ideally what would happen is as soon as the user selected Create New Podcast, that would open a new window. That's not how this works. So to kind of build it up, that required JavaScript that I just didn't understand how to do. And so there's like a method in JavaScript when the user clicks this or checks this or on click or something like that, on check, it automatically kind of loads new page. For this, we have to actually create the episode, and then that will load the new page. I don't even know if it's connected. Oh, cool. It is. It goes to a podcast new page, which is actually dead because we don't use it. I built something after that. But you can see how that would work, at least to redirect. And so to go into the code, what we're doing here is this is the drop-down menu, right? So we're making a select. So podcast ID, the form label podcast ID. Did it go back here? Cool. We're making a select. So that gives us the drop-down menu. We're going to select for the podcast ID. That's the field we fill in with this answer. And the options for select, so this is a Rails or a Ruby method, options for select, and then we pass in what those options are. And so I make it at choices. Since this is coming from the stars page, stars show, we want to build at choices in stars show. And so at choices is an array that's going to go in that drop-down menu. And for every podcast, we're going to push the pod, right? So I'm iterating through these. I'm pushing each podcast name and ID into this array called pod. And then I'm pushing anything in this array, pod, into the at choices array. And then last but not least, pushing at choices, I'm pushing create new podcast nil. So what this is doing is every podcast that's already been created goes into this array, into this list, and the name of the podcast is what shows, and the ID of the podcast is the value that submits to the form. And then last but not least, at the very end, we're always going to add create new podcast with a value of nil. Cool. We there so far? Okay, so again, if we choose create new podcast, the value that submits is nil. And then now we're on the episodes controller. And when we're creating a new episode, if the new episode podcast ID equals nil, which from the dropdown, the only way that could be is if you choose create new episode, then we're going to redirect to a new podcast path. And that's the page. We've changed it since. I'll put in the new path here, but then we redirect to the new podcast path and load the page where we can create the podcast, or what's coming next is we can actually look up a podcast, and I built a search function. And so we need to actually route to this page instead, where we can look up a podcast which searches iTunes. But that's probably something for next time. Right now, just wanted to kind of outline how to put that choice in the dropdown and redirect to a creation page and a creation path if the podcast doesn't exist. All right. Thanks for listening.